Hello there, and welcome to Preprints in Motion, the podcast taking a deep dive in the fast-paced world of preprints.
Join us as we sit down with early career researchers, discuss their latest preprint, and find out about their journey through the muddy marshes of academia.
Hit that subscribe button, leave a rating, and support us by heading over to buymeacoffee.com/preprints. But for now, let's get into the show.
Let's start with you introducing yourself, and why don't you tell us what you're currently most excited about in the open science space?
We'll start with my scientific background, I guess. So I have a PhD in neuroscience from the George Washington University. I'm an electrophysiologist by training and have spent sort of the course of my career at the bench studying the excitability of neurons in brain circuits related to Parkinson's disease, among other things. And I'm currently a program officer at the Coalition for Aligning Science, which is the capacity in which I'm doing all of this open science work. And I think for me, the thing that is most exciting about the open science space is, and especially the work that we're doing at CAS and with our Parkinson's initiative, is that we are really in a place where I think researchers are receptive and learning about open science and what practicing open science looks like from the bench, and funders are starting to think about it, journals are starting to think about it, and so I feel like we're really on the forefront of this sort of wave of sort of cultural change within the science community and how we do science, and that is exciting because I think really the pace of discovery and sort of collaboration and all of these things that we know are important as scientists but are often hindered by our publishing system and the way that we do science. I think, I feel like we're on the cusp of being able to change some of those things, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, the way we do science is madness, and I don't understand why we still do it that way. ASAP Bio, we've just been getting ready to start the fellows program up again this year. So I've been chatting to all the potential fellows before we start next month. And it's been really nice to see how global that sort of cultural shift is. Even in places where like preprinting isn't very well known, there's a really big push now to change that. And it's definitely cultural. It feels really good to see that.
Yeah, definitely.
Could you give us a little bit of an overview of what Aligning Science Across Parkinsons is and does for those who don't know?
Yeah, sure. So Aligning Science Across Parkinsons, or ASAP for short, is one of the largest privately funded investments in Parkinson's basic research. And so we fund international multidisciplinary teams to encourage exchange of ideas, foster innovation, and catalyze new experimental approaches. And our mission really is to accelerate the pace of discovery and inform the path to a cure for Parkinson's disease through collaboration, research enabling resources, and data sharing. And one of the ways that I think ASAP is really unique is that we fund these more high risk, high reward kinds of studies that might not be traditionally funded through other sources. And we also fund collaborative teams. And so these teams are made up of 3 to 5 labs from across various institutions across countries. And often we encourage that they have at least one person on the team that is not in the Parkinson's space to try and bring some new perspectives in as well. And so we're really focused on trying to really promote these ideas of collaboration, and this cross-pollination and new ideas from other fields can really help push the Parkinson's field forward.
Almost like diversity is good for science, some might say.
Exactly, 100%.
So the thing I like about ASAP is that you're one of those organizations that are kind of leading the way in how you do open science. That's what we're here to talk about today. Could you just give us a quick summary of your open science policies and some of the rationale behind why you have them as an organization?
Sure. So you're right. ASAP is really, I think, on the forefront of the funding landscape as far as pushing open science best practices. So our policy goes beyond simply requiring that papers be published open access or pre-printed even, to requiring that all newly generated data sets, protocols, code, and lab materials are shared in public repositories by the time of publication. And we also require not that just a preprint is posted, but that those preprints are posted by the time that a manuscript is submitted to a journal for peer review, with the idea there being that science is better when we share about it early and often. And so we are trying to accelerate the pace at which science that we fund is available to the larger Parkinson's community and to the research community. So our preprints are posted, 8 months in advance on average of our publications, and 8 months is a lot of time to get a lot of work done. And so that I think is important. And really why we have sort of operationalized these specific policies is because unfortunately, there is a lot of inertia in the scientific community about doing open science. I think researchers in general, will agree that open science is a good thing in theory, but in practice, there are many meta-analysis studies that have been done that show that we're not actually sharing data, code, protocols, and lab materials. And I think this is undermining the cumulative nature of science, right? So one of my favorite examples of this is the reproducibility project. And so they, in this project, looked at 193 experiments from high impact papers in cancer biology, and none contained sufficient information to allow them to repeat these experiments. And I know I have similar examples from my own research career trying to replicate experiments from other labs or even other people in my lab or former lab members, to no avail, or spending weeks writing a new analysis program that probably somebody has already created something that would work for my purposes out there. And so open science and these policies that we have are really about removing the barriers to scientific knowledge and advancement so that science is functioning, the most effectively. And I think this is particularly of value when we talk about sharing scientific data. The ultimate value of that data is often not predicted, and sometimes there are analyses that are not done on that original data set, or maybe you have a small N. And so in the future, being able to combine data sets for a larger meta-analysis and having more power, or being able to conduct new analyses, those are things that we can't predict the future discoveries that could come out of the data we're collecting today. And so we care a lot about making sure these research outputs are available to the research community, because we don't know the ultimate value. And even when we do, when it comes to things like sharing protocols or code, we know inherently that it speeds up the pace of science, but we're not doing it. And so we find as a funder, we're in the kind of key position to help incentivize this cultural shift.
Anyone who listened to our first episode back last month will be very happy to hear that from a funder, because I was talking to Mark Hansen about the strain on scientific publishing, and we both agreed that the people in the most powerful positions are actually the funders in this system to kind of really make that real change. The thing I will struggle with when it comes to advocating for open science, to me, open science is better science. But one of the big barriers to that is that actually better science is more work. You can't just put a paper out with no information behind it. You've got to actually have your data, and it's got to be usable, and not just here's all of my numbers that are of no use to anyone because I haven't put any labels to anything. Mm-hmm. You protocols and sharing materials, that's extra work. I have this issue a lot when I talk about peer review, because I hate peer review in its current form. I think it's absolute garbage. It doesn't do anything it's meant to do. But everyone tells you it's this quality control step and it's brilliant. And they struggle because to do quality control would be a huge amount of effort. And obviously nobody wants to do that because it's extra effort. So from the funder's perspective, obviously you can mandate these things and it's money. So people will do an awful lot of things to get funding and money. But do you have any reluctance from people who apply to any of your programs when it comes to actually implementing these things?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is something that we have to navigate. So like I said, I think many researchers agree with the basic principles of open science, but it's not part of the cultural norm. And also it is a lot of work, especially if you've never done it before, and especially if you're not thinking about it from the early stages of a research project. And so, I would say we have encountered varying levels of buy-in and reluctance from our grantees about this. We have really found that once researchers do start engaging in these practices, they realize that it's not as daunting as they previously feared, and really see that it does, in fact, improve their science and the quality of their science as well. And so if we can sort of get them over the initial sort of inertia and feeling that we're asking too much, this is a lot, even for a lot of money, we see a lot of buy-in from them about how it makes their science better and easier, and if they're starting it from the beginning, it's really actually not as daunting as they had feared that it was.
Yeah, just need to be well organized up front, which is just good lab practice.
It is good lab practice. I think, that's something I know one of the researchers that we fund has talked about, that actually the fact that we have implemented these and required these open science practices, she says, has changed the way that she actually runs her whole lab, and that it's made her lab as a whole more efficient and producing better science. And I think really that's the ideal for what we're trying to accomplish here.
So a lot of people would be familiar with science being expensive from the point of view of publishing and article processing charges. But this preprint really focuses on the costs associated with implementing and enforcing open science policies for funders. Most people don't really understand that there are costs beyond just publishing and that kind of stuff. Were there any unexpected costs for you as a funder with this? Or what would you say the most onerous costs are?
Yeah, so I think there are 2 points that I'll make here. So the first is, I think, again, the sort of user experience for open science is severely lacking, and people really don't always know what to do. And so the unexpected cost really for us, I think, is that we've had to learn to actively invest in ways to make this experience easier, from training to finding scalable solutions that are more all-purpose. And so we have invested a lot of time and energy from a sort of staffing perspective, creating workflows and educational guides for our grantees that we're also excited to sort of share with the wider community to helpfully pave the way for other funders and other communities to take these on as well. And so there's not like a number that I can put on that as far as a cost goes, but it is something that we spend a lot of time working on and thinking on. It's probably one of the largest costs as far as our time goes, just thinking about how do we create resources and workflows that help really get people over that initial inertia of starting to do open science. And then I think the second thing is that infrastructure for open science is kind of key for open science being able to function well and function long term. So again, this is not necessarily unexpected, but it is something that we think about a lot as a funder, that we have financial capital that we can put towards supporting infrastructure that when we see needs from our grantee community. And so those often are unexpected in the sense that those happen as needs arise. And so, for example, we fund a lot of omics related work, looking at sort of the underlying genetic component of Parkinson's disease. And it became very clear from talking to the people producing this work, especially using postmortem patient brain tissue, which is a really precious resource, that they wanted a way to really increase the impact that the data they were collecting was able to have. And so we have put some capital behind creating something called the CRN Cloud, which is an online public repository that houses the data that ASAP grantees are collecting omics data, so that others can access it and analyze it and pool it, and creating these harmonized collections to try and really amplify the impact that they're having. And so that's just one example of the kinds of places where I think as needs arise, we are stepping in to try and create infrastructure as we go. And I think that that's something that other funders are thinking about and will need to think about as well. Sort of, we have to have infrastructure in place to keep moving this ball down the field, as it were.
Yeah, I think researchers tend not to think about infrastructure until they need it. My PhD was in fruit flies, and anyone who works on fruit flies will know about Flybase because it's just an amazing resource, and that's infrastructure, and somebody has to pay for that. Flybase have kind of like a membership model.
You don't understand bioRxiv. Somebody pays for that. It's not just there. And so everything that we use as scientists costs money that comes from somewhere.
Yeah, and the infrastructure is so incredibly valuable and important. I have a friend who works for the UK Biobank, and the UK Biobank is an amazing resource for those researchers who need human tissue and who use it. Their funding is always in question as well, because it's an ongoing thing. It's not one of those attractive, fun new things that a lot of people like to complain about funders funding. It's one of those it needs constant funding for a long term, and might not be exciting, but is unbelievably important and vital to a lot of research labs.
Infrastructure, I think in science and in research, we are, the publishing model, right, is that you publish the exciting, sexy things and you fund the exciting, sort of sexy science. Infrastructure is none of those things, but it is sort of the bedrock of how science happens.
Yeah. So you do a lot of educational materials around these open science principles and the mandate you do, which I think are great, because I don't think it's something I see a lot of funders doing, and I wish a lot more would do, if not to make our life a bit easier. What advice would you give to maybe not just funders, but other people, also publishers, I think could do a much better job around education as well. What advice would you give to others in terms of how to help that culture shift happen with your average researcher?
Yeah, so I think there are two sort of barriers to this culture shift and to getting people on board. So the first is buy-in. This is something that we encounter a lot. People have concerns, right, about scooping or about the time that and effort it might take, or there's a laundry list of concerns that people have about engaging in these practices, that it might negatively impact their career or their science in some way. And so we do a lot of work towards dispelling those concerns, because they really they're myths. It's not true that open science practices harm your career or increase the probability of scooping or reduce the scientific quality. It's actually the opposite. And so, we have published blog posts about this, sharing specific, scientists are data-driven people, so sharing data and specific meta-analyses about this. We also host a lot of webinars and things like that, one-on-one calls with people to really dispel, listen to their concerns and dispel it, because I think that's the best way to get buy-in. If you can convince somebody, like, look, if you share all of your data and your protocols and your lab materials and whatever else, that's, an significantly increased number of citable pieces of work that you can include on your CV beyond just a publication that people can cite you for. When you post a preprint, you have sort of staked your flag in the sand on what you're working on, and many journals have a process in place to allow, make sure that the publication processes of sort of this idea of novelty is taking into account when preprints and those sorts of things. And so I think we're seeing, at least within our grantees, that there is a subtle shift happening of people getting more and more on board with it. And then I think the second big thing is that people need to focus on is just teaching people how to do the things that we're asking them to do. I think a good example here is, sharing data sets. People don't really understand what that means. So they might just throw a lot of data on Zenodo, and then they're like, I did it, it's there, but it's not really usable. And so we've been working a lot in the last year with our grantees on, how do you write a README file for your data set so that people can look at the data in the future and understand what's there and how they might use it? How do you think about like organizing it into a folder system so that it's more logical and digestible? If you're sharing tabular data, how do you share it in a way that is machine readable, that doesn't use variable names that aren't defined, so on and so forth. Merged cells, things that we all like to do to make our sheets look pretty, but that are not useful for sharing the data more broadly. And similarly, writing protocols, people, the cultural norm of writing a method section of a paper is like, as done previously, see this citation, that then says, as done previously, see this citation, and you end up down a rabbit hole. And so we've had to really work with our grantees on explaining very clearly, no, you have to write a step-by-step recipe-style protocol, like everything you need, every single step, and that's still something that, we're not there yet on any of these things. It's something that we recognize that we have aspirational policies, and we're not necessarily our grantees are not necessarily expected to meet them perfectly, and that our job really is to help shepherd them towards that ideal, and that really, I think, is the key.
Yeah, I once got back to 1954, I think, trying to track back a protocol from papers, and it was just one paper after the other saying, see this one, and it gave every few years, and then eventually got back to 1954. And it wasn't very helpful either.
No, it's really not. And I think, there's so many things in science as far as the methodology goes that are unsaid, even within a lab, from lab member to lab member, that it's just this sort of unknown or unspoken implicit sort of knowledge that, oh, I have to do it this way, but that we don't think about writing down. And so it's really trying to convey to people, like, no, you have to write. You need to write those things down. You need to share that information because we don't know if it matters or not, right? And so that's really the key.
Yeah, and this is one of those things where publishing infects everything. It's a hangover from publishing in print, where you have to you've got to cut everything down, so you're using as little space as possible. Whereas now that's completely unnecessary. We can have the full protocol, not the method, the actual protocol, as you said, as a recipe.
Right.
Which is, that's how all mine are written. And there's no reason I couldn't share those with people when I publish work. And then you would be able to follow mostly what I did.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too that our grantees are really learning to appreciate about some of our recommendations with our policy about, posting their protocols on protocols.io, or they're, posting their data to repositories. We require that they include a key resource table that includes the RIDs and DOIs, etc., for all of the research outputs, so the things that they generated in a paper, but also what they used in the paper. And we suggest that they upload that to Zenodo as well and provide the DOI in the paper. And so the benefit that they're seeing is that when, if there are changes that they need to make, if they, for example, have tried to register a new mouse line that they generated, but it's taking a long time, they can make updates as needed to their manuscript without having to go back through the journal and file an addendum and go through that whole rigmarole. And also it means that in the future, you can, if you have a protocol, you can fork that protocol and make adjustments. You're not constantly reinventing the wheel. And I think that it streamlines the whole sort of research to publication process for researchers. And we found that once the grantees start realizing that, they're very on board with the idea, but you have to get them there.
Yeah, but bioRxiv have just started doing the resource table as part of their little toolbar as well, which is quite nice now. Yeah, the other thing with things like protocols being in repositories is you can give authorship more appropriately as well, because now the person who actually spent their entire postdoc just getting the protocol to work can at least get credit for doing that, instead of being like the fifth author on a paper when really they should have been first.
I agree. I think that these open science practices are really good for credit and for making sure that, like I said, creating citable sources beyond just, we're moving away from the publication being sort of the end all be all, and that finally I feel like open science is helping us acknowledge what we all as researchers know is true, which is that research is a lot more than just the final publication, and open science practices help really, I feel like, codify that and the credit that goes along with that.
Yeah, I agree. So coming back to the funders, one of the big issues funders have generally is keeping track of everything and all the different outputs. And obviously, if you're having people do more outputs than a normal funder might normally do, how do you deal with that tracking, and how do you encourage policies to actually be followed?
Yes, so this is a great question. So all ASAP-funded manuscripts are required to undergo a comprehensive review process through which we ensure compliance with our policy. So what this looks like is we partner with DataSeer, who uses artificial intelligence and natural language processing to catalog the research inputs and outputs into a compliance report. And then those reports are reviewed by the ASAP Open Science team. So currently there are 3 Open Science team members on staff who do this work. So it's not a trivial amount of effort doing this. And then we correspond directly with the authors to help sort of guide them towards full compliance and help them figure out what they need to do to be compliant with the policy. And most manuscripts go through multiple rounds of compliance review before publication. So this is an iterative process. And we have a fairly, we use a very in-depth tracking system basically to keep track of all of these things. As far as encouraging or incentivizing that our policy is followed, we really assess commitment to open science at the LOI stage, so very early on when we're starting to consider funding. We also include language about our policy in the grant contract, and we also provide annual open science performance reports to grantees. And actually, we're currently working to move to where grantees have a live platform where they have access to their open science performance at any given point, with the hope that there will be no surprises. They know how they're doing and where they need to improve. And then I think really from an incentivization perspective, the biggest thing is that we pay article processing charges for ASAP-funded papers that are fully compliant with our open science policy. This is, again, not a trivial investment on the part of ASAP, but we do find that it's a really helpful intervention point and incentive for grantees that we can sort of leverage to get them to be compliant with our policies. Yeah, so that's it's sort of a multi-pronged approach, I would say.
Yeah, it's I don't think researchers really appreciate just how much effort is involved in that side of things, and why it's important to do that either.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and I think too, it's hard to really convey in this context the amount of work that goes into keeping track of all of this and our workflow to manage the number of papers that are coming in, again, because we see them at the draft stage, at the preprint stage, at the accepted stage, at the publication stage, all throughout the life of the manuscript. And it's hard to really capture the level of time commitment and that goes into that. And I think that it's why, it's something that we're thinking about a lot, trying to figure out how we can sort of reduce the level of white glove curation that is necessary for this process so that it can be outsourced to smaller funders or funders who don't have as large of a staff or the capacity to pay APCs and so on. And so that's something that, we're actively working on and thinking about how we can sort of, in partnership with DataSeer, about how we can really curate a process that other funders can can follow in the future, because I think that's critical for others being able to apply such a comprehensive open science policy, other than just a check mark that it is open access or not.
Yeah, I think funders and publishers and universities and institutions coming together more is really, really needed. I was at OASPA last year, and as I was going through talking to people at the conference, like everyone just kept blaming each other for all the problems and nothing moving forward. So I did, when I got up to give my talk, I did get up and insult everyone there by pointing out all the failures they were doing. But then remind everyone that the answers are all there.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think this is something we're thinking about as well. So we are members of the Open Funders Research Group, ORFG, as well as Coalition S, and really trying to leverage the community of funders that are thinking about these things and care about these things to see if we can work with the NIH or with publishers or the big players sort of in the research landscape to help further change the way that we do science.
So one of the things we like to do with this podcast is to relate the science and all the stuff we talk about to sort of academic culture a bit more broadly. And we do that through the lens of people's individuals' experiences. And actually, just this week, time of recording, this week we released an episode where I was talking about careers in and out of academia. And I was basically just telling my story of that. So what made you take the switch from being in academia to what I would class as academic adjacent?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think probably like a lot of people, I got into science and research because I was curious about the world and saw science as a good way to explore that curiosity, and also saw science as a way to make a difference. And I loved being at the bench. It definitely fed that curiosity, but the culture of academia, and I found myself feeling disillusioned with academia, and also the impact that I was making. I was studying a single ion channel in a single subpopulation of a very small population of neurons in the brain, and I was sitting in a dark room every day, patching neurons, and I just felt like am I really making the impact now that I want to have on society and on science in general? And so I started to sort of explore other ways to use my scientific expertise to create more of the impact that I was looking for. And I kind of stumbled upon this work actually, and felt very motivated by the sort of mission-driven nature of the work that we do here at Coalition for Aligning Science, and it just felt like the perfect sort of place to marry my science experience and expertise with my desire to sort of change not just how science was done, but also change the sort of landscape for patient populations as well.
How did you find that transition out of academia? Was that an easy transition? Was it because scientists often wrap themselves up, their identity is a scientist, and that's the thing I struggled with, so that can be quite difficult.
Yeah, so for me it was a lot more seamless than I anticipated. I will caveat that with I was very involved in many things away from the bench throughout my career at the bench. So it was in some ways not a surprise that I left the bench, because I always needed those other sort of aspects to feel like what I was doing was the most fulfilling for me. I think honestly the biggest challenge to adjusting was the remote aspect of the work, not going into the lab every day. And remote work inherently requires more meetings per week than I was used to as a bench scientist, when I was just having like a lab meeting every week. But overall, I think it was a pretty easy transition for me. I feel very much like I use the same skills now as I did at the bench, but just sort of like in a different application, turned on its head in a way, for coming at it from a different perspective. And so that has made the transition, I think, pretty seamless for me.
Yeah, getting out of the lab and doing other stuff is always one of the things I tell at least every PhD student. I also think postdocs should do it, but PhD students have a lot more freedom to get out and do that. And I think it's so beneficial to do so.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I was actually talking to an old friend of mine recently who's thinking about making the transition and was asking for advice about moving away from the bench. And this is exactly what I was telling her. I said, you need to take opportunities to grow and flex, what we call soft skills in the sciences, but like in a context that you're passionate about. So like maybe you care about teaching or mentoring students, or maybe like you're really into workflows and project management, or maybe you volunteer with a nonprofit organization or a student organization or whatever that looks like for you. I think getting away from the bench and learning how to apply the skills that you already have, but in other contexts, I think is really important for anybody, but especially if you're thinking about moving away from the bench.
Yeah. So what advice would you give to someone who's thinking about leaving science or leaving academic science?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, I think I would say, like, really look for and take every opportunity to really, like, apply your skills in other settings away from the bench. I also think for me, it was really helpful to do informational interviews with people who were doing work that I thought was interesting away from the bench. I don't know about other people, but for me, when I started thinking about transitioning away from the bench, I had never considered that there was anything else I could do with my PhD other than be a research scientist. And so taking the time to talk to other people and discover the other options that were available to me, and also get some validation that other career paths away from becoming a PI and running my own lab were not only valid, but were clearly very fulfilling to other people as well, I think was really, really helpful. Also, if you're unsure, like I was, about where exactly you might want to go away from the bench, LinkedIn is your best friend. I looked at every possible job opening and started collecting a list of organizations that had job openings that I thought were doing things that were interesting, and collecting a list of sort of like buzzwords of, what are the kinds of skills that are being used in these jobs that either I need to develop or I need to figure out how to put on display, that I know I have but aren't necessarily the same thing as I can do patch clamp or something, like how we usually think about our resumes from the perspective of being a bench scientist.
I still struggle with that, not being at the bench. I can't quite explain what I do to people. I don't really know what I'm good at or what I do. But I have skills. They're just in the cloud somewhere, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. I struggle with it too. I think for me, it was very helpful to do like a mapping exercise. And so I took this language of these soft skills that we're not used to thinking about as a bench scientist, and then took my resume that said, here's all the stuff I've done in the lab, and tried to map them onto each other, to be like, okay, I know I have project management skills because of this concrete thing that I did when I was in my PhD or in my postdoc or whatever, or I know that like I have communication skills because of something concrete that I, did. And I think that was very helpful for me to try and like figure out who I am beyond just the technical skills that I have.
Yeah, I was giving a talk at a careers event at the end of last year, and after the talk, someone came up to me. We were just chatting about stuff, and they'd been applying for jobs for ages. And I seemed to blow their mind when I said, all the lab work you do is actually project management skills, and that's how you should be framing it. And I think that's a really good idea, to sit down with these buzzwords and pull them out. And because of course, when you're applying for jobs, you've got to use those words and really spell it out.
100%. My grad school PI, used to tell me in preparation for committee meetings, you have to hit people upside the head with it. Like, you just have to spell it out so much more obviously than you think. And I think that's also good advice for preparing resumes and job applications. You have to really spell out exactly what your skills are and why and how you can demonstrate those skills.
So just to wrap up, I've got one more question for you, and I figured we'd end on a nice positive because the world seems to be on fire at the moment. In terms of the open science space, or just science in general, what would you like to see the future look like? What would you like to see happen the most? And this can be as idealistic and unrealistic as you like.
My answer, I think, is a little bit biased because I do spend a lot of time, as I think it's clear from this conversation, thinking about education and training, trying to get people to get on board the open science train, as it were. And I think about that a lot in the context of trainees, because I think those trainees are the future of science. And one frustration that I have is that often I get trainees on board, but their PIs are not. And so, I mean, I think for me, I'm really excited about the next generation, because I think that is really where we're going to start seeing the biggest change in how science is done, and that people will have PIs running labs who are supporting their trainees' efforts to do open science and truly do open science, not just post open access, but post, share things that and encourage things to be reused and retooled, and really who are thinking about science, how science, we can utilize the science that's already been done to have an impact on the field. And I think related to that too, the scientific publishing world is a mess. I think it's a big problem with the way science is done. And the reality is we can get as much buy-in as we want from PIs and trainees and the people who are doing the research, but as long as institutions make decisions based on, well, you published in Nature, you published in Science, and Nature and Science can charge whatever they want for you to publish with them, and they can make whatever rules about how those papers and the things that went into those papers are shared, the change is only going to be incremental. And I think, I would love to see the current publishing model just completely done away with, honestly. I think the idea that we have to really get people away from the idea that publishing in these big journals is the way. And I think that, like I said, it's a multi-pronged approach, right? Like, funders and institutions also have to de-emphasize the importance of that. I don't think the publishing world is going to change unless we are leading the charge and making it so that it's not profitable for them to behave the way that they do. I think that is the biggest change that needs to happen in the realm of science, and I think it's probably the most idealistic, because it's going to take a lot of us working together to make it happen. I don't know that, there's a lot of movement and excitement around Diamond OA right now, but that's not anywhere close to the place where I think it's going to be a viable solution. People can publish in Science and then theoretically post the author accepted manuscript somewhere, but the mechanisms by which that happens are really unclear, and there's not really a good way to do that at the moment, or a good repository. And scientists are often signing their, they don't have rights retention, and so with some of these journals, and I think there's so many issues related to the publishing world that are impeding the work that those of us in the open science space are trying to do. And it's going to take more than just those of us who care about open science to change it, right? Institutions and other funders and the scientists themselves are all going to have to push publishers to change. And I think, de-invest ourselves from that model and the name that comes with Nature and Science and Cell.
Yeah, that's very validating to hear, because I've spent a huge amount of effort last year pushing ASAP Bio in that direction. So that is now like our that's the direction we're focusing on and trying to change the recognition structures. Not that it was easy to get that through. But yeah, I think it is.
No, of course.
The problem is, right, especially with, this is where I'm going to get myself into trouble, but especially with something like ASAP, which is meant to be kind of a neutral organization, I find it really difficult because I don't think you can work with publishers for the most part to bring about these changes.
No.
Because, I mean, open access is a really good example, right? The open access movement made that mistake of allowing the publishers in and working with them, and you ended up with article processing charges and business models. And I think we're heading...
Right, well, the whole transformative journal thing was just a lie. Like, it didn't actually happen.
Yeah.
So I completely agree. I think that the only way to change the publishing model is to, it's like a boycott, right? Like to put, I'm not saying we boycott publishing, obviously, but like that if the funders and the academic institutions and the researchers themselves are putting enough pressure on the publishers, theoretically, things, I would like to be optimistic that things can change.
Yeah. I think Diamond Away is one potential route. I don't really like Diamond Away because I don't think it solves enough problems. But then Publish Review Curate is spoken about a lot. I also hate Publish Review Curate, which will not go down well with some people. We need real change.
Well, and I was just saying, the Gates Foundation is moving away from publishing entirely. And so I think there are a lot of people who are thinking about this in different creative ways. And so I am hopeful that this is something that we can solve. I would like to believe that will happen sooner rather than later. But I think it's the biggest hindrance to open science practices having, and science in general, having the most impact that it can. And I think as long as the status quo remains as it is, where science is going to be hindered in its advancement and impact.
That seems like the perfect place to end, actually. So I think we'll stop. We'll stop on that.
Sure that was an uplifting ending, but
it was more positive than I was.
Yes, I remain hopeful. So that I think is good. I remain hopeful that we can change it. I think being on this side of things now, I really see the power that that funders and academic institutions have. We are the ones that are holding the money, and that's what publishers really care about. And so I think if we can all get on the same page, we have the ability to really affect some change, which is exciting. So we'll see.
It is, and it is very slowly happen. It's happening. It is happening. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This was great.
And that's the show, folks. If you enjoyed listening, then hit that subscribe button to get the latest updates straight to wherever it is you're listening. Don't forget to rate us on Spotify. Until next time, have a good week.
This podcast was produced by Rippling Ideas, turning ideas into waves.